The coordinates came through at 3:47 hours, encrypted and urgent. Somewhere in the Hindu Kush mountains of eastern Afghanistan, 8 Navy SEALs were pinned down by Taliban fighters in a compound that intelligence had labeled cleared. The nearest air support was supposedly 40 minutes out, too far, too late. The team leader's voice crackled through the static. "Overlord, this is Trident 6. We need immediate air support. We've got wounded and we're running low on everything that matters." In the operations center at Bagram Airfield, controllers stared at their screens with the hollow expression of men who delivered too much bad news. The closest fighter jets were engaged in operations over Helmand Province. Apache helicopters were grounded for maintenance. The cavalry wasn't coming, and everyone knew what that meant in these mountains where coalition forces had learned to measure time in heartbeats and ammunition in prayers. But 300 miles away, at an undisclosed forward operating base, Captain Vera Ghost Kozlova was already strapping herself into the cockpit of an F-16C Fighting Falcon that wasn't supposed to exist on any official manifest. Her aircraft bore no squadron markings, no identifying tail numbers that would appear in standard databases. To most of the military bureaucracy, Ghost and her fighter were a clerical error, a budget line item that accountants assumed someone else would eventually correct. The base operations officer, a weary colonel with 23 years of service, approached her aircraft with the reluctant gait of a man about to ask for a miracle. "Ghost, I know what I'm about to ask is," he began, but she was already running through her pre-flight checklist with the mechanical precision of someone who'd done this dance more times than she cared to count. "How many?" she asked without looking up from her instruments, her voice carrying the slight accent that hinted at a childhood spent somewhere between Kiev and Brooklyn. "8 SEALs, grid reference Foxtrot 7-9er Alpha, enemy strength unknown but they're in a bad way." Ghost's hands never paused in their movement across the cockpit controls, but something shifted in her posture, a tightening around the eyes that spoke of calculations being made in the space between heartbeats. The mountains of Afghanistan had a way of swallowing aircraft whole, and the Taliban had grown sophisticated in their understanding of American air power. This wasn't a training exercise where mistakes earned you a lecture and a second chance. "Time to target," she asked, though she was already computing flight paths and fuel consumption in her head. 18 minutes if you push her hard, 22 if you want to come back." The ghost of a smile touched her lips as she sealed her helmet. "Sir, respectfully, when have I ever not come back?" The afterburner ignition painted the pre-dawn darkness in shades of blue flame as the F-16 lifted off the runway, climbing into the thin air above the sleeping base. Ghost banked hard to the northeast, her aircraft disappearing into the star-filled darkness like a predator returning to hunt in familiar territory. Behind her, ground crews were already calculating fuel loads and ordnance requirements for aircraft that might never return to need them. In the operations center, radio chatter from Trident 6 painted an increasingly desperate picture. Small arms fire had intensified. RPGs were impacting close enough to shake dust from the compound walls. The team medic was working on 2 wounded, using medical supplies that were running as thin as their ammunition. Time was measured now in minutes rather than hours, and everyone listening knew that minutes had a way of evaporating in the Hindu Kush like morning mist. "Overlord Trident 6, we've got movement on 3 sides now. If that air support doesn't show up soon, we're going to need to talk about other options." The team leader's voice carried the controlled tension of a professional who understood that other options in this context meant calling in danger-close fire missions on their own position, a last resort that saved the intelligence while accepting the cost in American lives. But Ghost was already descending through 25,000 feet, her radar painting a picture of the terrain ahead, while her targeting systems began the complex calculations that would turn mathematical precision into tactical salvation. The F-16 was loaded with a mixed ordnance package: 2 AGM-65 Maverick missiles for hardened targets, 4 GBU 38 Joint Direct Attack munitions for precision strikes, and 500 rounds of 20 ammunition for the M61 Vulcan cannon. It was enough firepower to level a small village, but in the mountains of Afghanistan, the difference between precision and devastation was often measured in meters rather than miles. As she approached the target area, Ghost switched her radio to the frequency that would connect her directly with the ground team. Trident 6, this is Ghost. I'm your air support. Give me a situation report and mark your position. The response came back immediately, tinged with surprise that bordered on disbelief. Ghost, Trident 6. Thought air support was 40 minutes out. We're in a 2-story compound, northeast corner. Enemy positions are marked with IR strobes on the west and south sides. We've got 2 wounded and we're down to our last magazines. Ghost's eyes swept across her instruments as she dropped to 8,000 feet, low enough that the mountains loomed like ancient sentinels in her peripheral vision. Copy that, Trident 6. I need you to pop smoke on your position and keep your heads down. I'm coming in from the east. The next 60 seconds would determine whether 8 American warriors went home to their families, or became another casualty statistic in a war that had already stretched far longer than anyone had originally planned. Ghost armed her weapons systems and began her attack run. The F-16, screaming through the mountain, passes at a speed that turned the landscape below into a blur of rock and shadow. The smoke grenade bloomed orange against the gray stone of the compound, a beacon that marked the difference between friend and enemy in a world where that distinction could shift as quickly as the mountain winds. Ghost's targeting computer locked onto the Taliban positions with the cold efficiency of silicon and mathematics, but her finger on the trigger carried the weight of human judgment, the understanding that in warfare, the most sophisticated technology was ultimately guided by the oldest of human imperatives: protect your own. Her first pass scattered the attacking Taliban fighters, the thunderclap of her afterburner mixing with the sharp crack of 20 rounds impacting stone and earth. But Ghost knew this was just the opening move in a deadly chess game played across mountainous terrain where every ridge could hide an enemy position, and every shadow could conceal a surface-to-air missile team that had been waiting for exactly this moment. As she banked hard to line up for her second attack run, Ghost caught a glimpse of movement on a ridge line 2 miles to the north, a flash of reflected sunlight that could have been binoculars, or could have been the optics on a shoulder-fired missile system. In the complex calculus of air-to-ground combat, paranoia wasn't a character flaw. It was a survival trait that separated the living from the casualties. The Taliban had learned to adapt to American air power through hard experience and bitter losses. They understood that F-16s were most vulnerable during their attack runs, when pilots were focused on their targets and flying predictable flight paths. Ghost knew this too, which was why she varied her approach angles and altitude profiles with each pass, turning the sky above the compound into a 3-dimensional puzzle that enemy gunners couldn't solve with their crude but deadly weapons. Trident 6 Ghost, first pass complete. I've scattered the immediate threats, but you've got more company moving in from the north. Can you displace to the east wall of the compound? Negative, Ghost. We've got 2 who can't be moved right now. We're going to have to hold this position. The tactical situation was crystallizing into the kind of scenario that military planners used in war colleges to illustrate the difference between textbook strategy and battlefield reality. The SEALs were trapped in a static position with wounded teammates who couldn't be moved, while enemy forces were maneuvering to surround them with the patient methodology of hunters who understood that time was on their side. Every minute that passed brought more Taliban fighters into the area, drawn by the sound of combat like wolves responding to the scent of blood. Ghost checked her fuel gauge and weapon status as she climbed to 15,000 feet for another attack run. The numbers told a story that every combat pilot understood. She had enough ordnance to buy the ground team time, but not enough to eliminate every threat in these mountains. The mission was evolving from a rescue operation into something more complex and dangerous, a holding action that would require her to stay in the fight until extraction assets could reach the trapped SEALs. The radio crackled with updates from the operations center at Bagram. Ghost, Overlord, be advised, we have extraction assets spinning up, but they're still 28 minutes out. Can you maintain air support until then? 28 minutes in a single-engine fighter over hostile territory was an eternity measured in fuel consumption and enemy reaction time. Ghost ran the calculations in her head while simultaneously monitoring her threat detection systems for signs of surface-to-air missiles that could turn her F-16 into a fireball scattered across 10 square miles of Afghan mountainside. Overlord Ghost, I can give you 25 minutes, maybe 30 if I'm very careful with my throttle settings. After that, I'm going to need a tanker or a place to land that's closer than home. The mathematics of combat aviation were unforgiving in their precision. Every gallon of fuel burned reduced her loiter time over the target. Every ordnance release decreased her ability to engage new threats. Every minute that passed increased the likelihood that Taliban reinforcements would arrive in sufficient numbers to overwhelm both the trapped SEALs and any extraction force that might reach them. But Ghost had been calculating these kinds of equations for longer than most people realized, in skis above countries whose names appeared in classified after-action reports rather than newspaper headlines. She understood that warfare was ultimately about buying time, time for reinforcements to arrive, time for wounded soldiers to be stabilized, time for extraction helicopters to navigate through mountain passes, where a single miscalculation could send an aircraft crashing into peaks that had been claiming lives for thousands of years. As she rolled into her third attack run, Ghost's earpiece crackled with a transmission that made her blood run cold. Ghost, Trident 6, we've got multiple vehicles approaching from the west. Looks like they're bringing friends to the party. Through her targeting pod, Ghost could see dust clouds on the mountain road that led to the compound. Vehicles moving fast enough to indicate urgency, numerous enough to suggest that the Taliban were committing significant resources to this engagement. The tactical situation was deteriorating from a small unit action into something that resembled a conventional battle, with the 8 trapped SEALs serving as the focal point around which a much larger conflict was beginning to crystallize. She selected her first GBU-38 and locked onto the lead vehicle in the convoy, her finger hovering over the trigger while her eyes swept the sky for threats. The Taliban had been known to coordinate ground attacks with surface-to-air missile ambushes, using American rescue operations as opportunities to draw in high-value targets like combat aircraft. Ghost's F-16 represented millions of dollars in military hardware and decades of pilot training, a prize that enemy forces would gladly sacrifice a dozen fighters to claim. The precision-guided munitions separated from her aircraft with the subtle shift in weight distribution that every fighter pilot learns to recognize. 5 seconds later, the lead vehicle in the Taliban convoy disappeared in a flash of orange flame and black smoke, the explosion echoing off the mountain walls like thunder rolling through stone canyons. The remaining vehicles scattered like startled birds, seeking cover among the rocks and ridges that offered concealment from aerial attack. "Good hit, Ghost," came the voice from Trident 6, carrying a note of satisfaction that barely masked the underlying tension. "That's bought us some breathing room, but we're still seeing movement on multiple approaches. These guys aren't giving up easy." Ghost was already lining up for another pass, her weapons system cycling through targeting solutions with mechanical efficiency. But she was also thinking 3 moves ahead, considering contingencies and backup plans with the strategic mindset that had been drilled into her through years of advanced tactical training. The Taliban weren't retreating, they were regrouping, which meant they had a plan that extended beyond simply overrunning a single compound. The next few minutes would reveal whether that plan included surface-to-air missiles, whether it involved additional ground forces moving through the maze of mountain valleys, and whether the 8 SEALs trapped in the compound would live to see another sunrise. Ghost armed her second precision-guided bomb and began her descent, the F-16 cutting through the thin mountain air like a blade drawn across silk, beautiful and deadly in equal measure. Her radio erupted with multiple voices as the tactical situation evolved with the fluid unpredictability that characterized combat in terrain where every ridge could hide an enemy position, and every shadow could conceal a lethal surprise. The operations center at Bagram was coordinating extraction assets, while simultaneously tracking the movement of additional enemy forces throughout the region. Intelligence analysts were updating threat assessments in real time, their voices carrying the controlled urgency of professionals who understood that the wrong decision could cascade into tragedy within minutes. Ghost Overlord, be advised, we're tracking additional vehicle movement 15 kilometers north of your position. Unknown numbers, unknown intentions, but they're moving fast in your direction. The tactical picture was expanding beyond the immediate vicinity of the trapped SEAL team. What had begun as a small unit rescue operation was threatening to become a larger engagement that could draw in significant military resources and potentially escalate into the kind of pitched battle that generated headlines and congressional hearings. Ghost understood the implications even as she focused on the immediate task of keeping 8 Americans alive in a landscape that had swallowed countless warriors throughout history. She released her second precision-guided munition at a Taliban position that had been directing effective small arms fire at the compound, the explosion silencing the enemy gunners, but also revealing new muzzle flashes from positions that hadn't been active moments before. The Taliban were employing classic guerrilla tactics, using the death of one fighting position to reveal the location of others, drawing the American aircraft into an increasingly complex engagement where every successful strike potentially exposed new threats. Trident 6 Ghost, I'm seeing new movement on your south side. Looks like they're trying to flank around to your rear. Copy Ghost, we've got eyes on them. Can you put some steel on that ridgeline about 200 meters south of our position? Ghost checked her remaining ordnance, 2 Maverick missiles, 2 more precision-guided bombs, and ammunition for her 20 cannon. Each weapon system had its optimal engagement parameters, its advantages and limitations in the complex three-dimensional chess game of modern air combat. The Mavericks were perfect for hardened targets like bunkers or armored vehicles, but might be overkill for individual fighters. The precision-guided bombs could eliminate entire enemy positions, but took time to program and required her to maintain straight and level flight during the terminal guidance phase. The cannon was immediate and devastating, but required her to fly low and slow, exposing her aircraft to ground fire. She opted for the cannon, rolling into a strafing run that would take her F-16 through the mountain passes at an altitude that made her vulnerable to everything from rifle fire to rocket-propelled grenades. The risk calculation was simple: 8 American lives balanced against 1 aircraft and 1 pilot, with the tactical situation deteriorating rapidly enough that conservative approaches might prove insufficient to prevent a massacre. The 20 rounds walked across the ridgeline like deadly rain, each impact sending up puffs of stone dust and smoke that marked the temporary graves of Taliban fighters who had chosen the wrong mountainside for their ambush. Ghost pulled up hard, the G-forces pressing her back into her ejection seat as she climbed away from the target area, her eyes scanning the sky for the telltale smoke trail of a surface-to-air missile that could turn her victory into Pyrrhic tragedy within seconds. But the sky remained clear, and her threat warning system stayed silent as she banked around for another pass. The Taliban either lacked the sophisticated anti-aircraft systems that could engage a maneuvering F-16, or they were saving their missiles for a more opportune moment when her aircraft would be more vulnerable. Neither possibility offered much comfort as Ghost considered the tactical situation developing around the trapped SEAL team. Overlord Ghost, I need an update on those extraction assets. The situation down here is getting more complicated by the minute. Ghost, Overlord. Extraction birds are 22 minutes out. They're pushing as hard as they can, but they've got to navigate through some difficult terrain. 22 minutes felt like an eternity when measured against fuel consumption and ammunition expenditure. Ghost checked her gauges again, running mental calculations that balanced her remaining resources against the evolving threat picture. She had perhaps 15 minutes of effective loiter time before fuel considerations would force her to either leave the area or commit to a one-way mission that might or might not save the men on the ground. The radio crackled with a new voice, this one carrying the distinctive accent of the team's senior enlisted advisor. "Ghost, this is Trident 6 Alpha. We've got movement on all sides now. These guys are coordinating better than we expected. I count at least 20 fighters, maybe more, and they're bringing some heavy weapons to bear." Heavy weapons meant everything from machine guns to mortars to recoilless rifles, crew-served systems that could pin down the SEALs and methodically destroy their defensive positions. Ghost's remaining ordnance was sufficient to eliminate several such positions, but the mathematics of combat were working against her. Every Taliban fighter she killed seemed to be replaced by two more, drawn to the sound of battle like moths to flame. She armed her third precision-guided munition and began another attack run, this one targeted at a mortar position that had been dropping rounds uncomfortably close to the compound. The weapon separated cleanly from her aircraft, its guidance systems locked onto coordinates that had been laser-designated by one of the SEALs using equipment that turned individual soldiers into precision artillery spotters. The explosion eliminated the mortar crew, but revealed something that made Ghost's blood run cold. Fresh tire tracks in the dust, leading to concealed positions that suggested the Taliban had been preparing for this engagement longer than anyone had realized. This wasn't an opportunistic attack by local fighters. It was a planned operation that had used the compound as bait to draw in American forces that could then be systematically destroyed. Trident 6 Ghost, you guys need to know that this whole thing smells like a setup. I'm seeing signs of preparation that suggest they've been waiting for someone to come rescue whoever was supposed to be in that compound. The implications hung in the radio silence that followed her transmission. If the compound had been deliberately compromised to draw in rescue forces, then the 8 SEALs were fighting not just for their lives, but as unwitting participants in a larger tactical deception that could claim additional American aircraft and personnel before the day was over. "Copy, Ghost," came the eventual reply from the team leader, his voice carrying the flat affect of someone processing information that fundamentally altered his understanding of the tactical situation. That explains why they keep showing up with fresh fighters and better coordination than we usually see. Ghost was already considering the implications for her own mission. If this was indeed a carefully planned ambush, then the Taliban might have surface-to-air missiles positioned along likely flight paths, waiting for American aircraft to establish predictable patterns that could be exploited by patient gunners with sophisticated weapons. Her F-16 had been maneuvering randomly to avoid this exact scenario, but fuel considerations would eventually force her into more constrained flight patterns that enemy forces could anticipate and exploit. The next transmission from the operations center confirmed her worst fears. "All stations, Overlord. Be advised, we have intelligence reports suggesting increased Taliban activity throughout the region. Exercise extreme caution with flight operations." Translation: the enemy had been planning this engagement, possibly for weeks, and American forces were walking into a kill zone that had been carefully prepared to maximize casualties among rescue personnel. Ghost checked her remaining fuel and ordnance one more time, the numbers painting a picture that was becoming increasingly stark with each passing minute. She had 2 Maverick missiles, 1 precision-guided bomb, and enough 20 ammunition for perhaps 2 more strafing runs. Her fuel state would allow her to remain in the area for another 18 minutes, assuming she didn't need to engage in high-speed maneuvering that would dramatically increase her consumption rate. The extraction helicopters were still 19 minutes out, assuming they didn't encounter resistance during their approach through mountain passes that could easily conceal anti-aircraft systems. The mathematics were simple and unforgiving. She could protect the SEALs for perhaps 12 more minutes, after which they would be on their own until the extraction birds arrived. In that gap, anything could happen, and in Afghanistan's mountains, anything usually meant something bad. Ghost armed both Maverick missiles and began hunting for targets that would justify their use. The AGM-65 was designed to destroy armored vehicles and hardened bunkers, but in the fluid tactical situation developing around the compound, she needed to maximize the psychological impact of her remaining strikes. Fear was often more effective than firepower in breaking up coordinated enemy attacks, and the Maverick's distinctive explosion signature had a way of making surviving Taliban fighters reconsider their commitment to the current engagement. Her targeting systems locked onto what appeared to be a command post established in a cave mouth about a kilometer from the compound. Intelligence analysts would later debate whether the position actually contained Taliban leadership or was simply a well-constructed fighting position. But in the moment, Ghost's decision was based on tactical necessity rather than intelligence certainty. She needed to disrupt enemy coordination, and the cave represented the most likely location for whoever was orchestrating the attack on the trapped SEALs. The first Maverick missile streaked away from her aircraft like a guided meteor, its rocket motor painting a white contrail against the gray Afghan sky. Ghost was already maneuvering to avoid potential return fire when the warhead detonated, the explosion sending a pillar of smoke and debris climbing into the thin mountain air. Secondary explosions suggested that the position had indeed contained ammunition or equipment worth destroying, lending credibility to her target selection. "Outstanding hit, Ghost," came the call from Trident 6. "That seems to have gotten their attention. We're seeing movement away from the compound on multiple sides." But Ghost knew that tactical withdrawals could be tactical repositioning, especially when dealing with enemy forces that had demonstrated sophisticated planning and coordination. The Taliban might be pulling back to allow her to exhaust her remaining ordnance, after which they could resume their attack with reduced risk from air support. Alternatively, they might be repositioning to engage the incoming extraction helicopters with weapons systems that were currently concealed among the rocks and ridges. She selected her final precision-guided bomb and began searching for a target that would maximize its impact on enemy morale and tactical capabilities. Her sensors painted a picture of movement throughout the area, individual fighters and small groups displacing through terrain that offered concealment from aerial observation. The challenge was distinguishing between genuine threats and Taliban fighters who were simply trying to survive an encounter with American air power. The radio crackled with an update from the extraction force. "Overlord, Dustoff 7-1. We're 15 minutes out from target area. Request current threat assessment." Dustoff 7-1, Overlord. "Threat level remains high. Expect ground fire during approach and extraction. Air support is on station and will remain until you're clear." Ghost felt the weight of responsibility settling across her shoulders like a lead blanket. 2 helicopters filled with rescue personnel were flying through mountain passes toward a landing zone that might be surrounded by enemy forces armed with weapons capable of destroying aircraft. Her job was to ensure that those helicopters could complete their mission and return home with everyone aboard, including the 8 SEALs who had been fighting for their lives for the past 30 minutes. She armed her final precision-guided munition and selected a target that intelligence analysts had identified as a possible staging area for Taliban reinforcements. The weapons guidance systems locked onto the coordinates, while Ghost considered the tactical implications of expending her last bomb. Once it was gone, she would be down to her 20 cannon, and whatever psychological impact her continued presence might have on enemy forces, who understood that American pilots rarely abandoned their ground forces. The bomb separated from her aircraft with a familiar shift in flight characteristics, beginning its guided descent toward a target that might contain nothing more than empty stone and shadow. But in warfare, uncertainty was a constant companion, and pilots learned to make decisions based on incomplete information and tactical intuition, rather than perfect knowledge of enemy dispositions and intentions. The explosion painted the mountainside in shades of orange and black, the smoke rising like a funeral pyre for Taliban fighters whose families would never know how or where they died. Ghost banked away from the target area, her eyes scanning the sky for surface-to-air missiles that could turn her successful attack into a final moment of vulnerability. The threat warning systems remained silent, but she knew that silence could be as deceptive as the mountains themselves. Ghost Overlord. Extraction birds are 12 minutes out. Can you maintain coverage until they're clear? Overlord Ghost. I can give you 8 more minutes of effective coverage, maybe 10, if I push the fuel margins harder than recommended. The numbers were converging toward a solution that might save everyone or might result in multiple aircraft losses in terrain that had been claiming military hardware since the Soviet occupation. Ghost checked her ammunition counter. 200 rounds of 20 remaining, enough for one more strafing run or 2 brief engagements with targets of opportunity. The radio erupted with multiple transmissions as the tactical situation reached its critical phase. The extraction helicopters were navigating through mountain passes, while Taliban forces regrouped for what might be a final assault on the compound. Ghost's fuel gauges showed levels that would require careful flight planning to reach the nearest airfield, assuming she didn't encounter headwinds or need to conduct high-speed maneuvering that would dramatically increase her consumption rate. Trident 6 Ghost. I'm going to need you guys to mark your exact position one more time. The extraction birds are going to need precise coordinates, and I want to make sure I don't put ordnance anywhere near your location. Copy Ghost, popping smoke in 3, 2, 1 mark. The orange smoke grenade bloomed against the gray stone, a beacon that marked 8 American lives in a landscape where life and death were often separated by margins measured in meters rather than miles. Ghost noted the position on her tactical display while simultaneously monitoring her fuel state and the approaching helicopter formation that represented salvation for the trapped SEALs. But salvation in Afghanistan's mountains was never guaranteed, and Ghost understood that the next few minutes would determine whether this rescue operation became another success story or another tragedy in a war that had already claimed too many young Americans. She armed her cannon and began what might be her final attack run, the F-16 screaming through mountain passes that had witnessed countless battles throughout history. The approaching helicopters represented the culmination of a complex rescue operation that had drawn in resources from across the theater of operations. 2 U-60 Black Hawks configured for medical evacuation, escorted by 2 U-64 Apache attack helicopters that bristled with weapon systems designed to suppress ground fire during the critical moments when the rescue birds would be most vulnerable. Behind them flew a CH-47 Chinook loaded with additional medical personnel and equipment, insurance against the possibility that the casualties would be more severe than current reports indicated. Ghost's earpiece crackled with transmissions from the approaching formation. Ghost, Dustoff 7-1, we have visual on your smoke. What's the current threat picture around the landing zone? Dustoff 7-1 Ghost. I've been working the area for the past 20 minutes. Enemy strength is difficult to assess, but they've been conducting coordinated attacks from multiple directions. I'd recommend coming in fast and staying low until you're ready for final approach. The helicopter formation adjusted its approach vector based on Ghost's recommendations, the pilots trusting in the tactical assessment of a fixed-wing aviator who had been engaged with enemy forces while they were still navigating mountain passes 50 miles away. This was the kind of trust that held military operations together, professionals relying on the expertise and judgment of other professionals whose decisions could mean the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure. Ghost rolled into her final strafing run, the 20 cannon sending tracers streaking toward Taliban positions that had been harassing the compound with intermittent small arms fire. The rounds impacted among the rocks like deadly fireworks, each explosion representing the end of a threat to the rescue operation that was now entering its most critical phase. As she climbed away from the target area, Ghost's fuel warning light illuminated, a red reminder that she was approaching the mathematical limits of her aircraft's endurance. She had perhaps 5 more minutes before fuel considerations would force her to leave the area, regardless of the tactical situation on the ground. The extraction helicopters would have to complete their mission without fixed-wing air support, relying instead on their own defensive systems and the suppressive fire provided by the Apache escorts. Overlord Ghost, I'm approaching bingo fuel. I can give you 3 more minutes of coverage, then I have to depart for recovery. Copy Ghost, understood. You've done outstanding work up there. The ground team knows it and so do we. But outstanding work didn't guarantee successful outcomes in Afghanistan's mountains, where the terrain itself seemed hostile to human ambition and mechanical precision. Ghost watched her fuel gauges with the attention of someone who understood that running out of jet fuel above enemy territory was a mistake that could only be made once. The first US-60 was beginning its final approach to the compound, the pilot threading his aircraft through mountain valleys that left little margin for error. Ghost could see the helicopter through her targeting systems, a fragile-looking machine carrying the hopes of 8 trapped Americans who had been fighting for their lives, while she provided what cover she could from the sky above. Trident 6, Dustoff 7-1, coming in hot on your east side. Have your wounded ready for immediate extraction. The radio chatter increased as the rescue reached its climax, voices overlapping with updates and warnings and tactical assessments delivered in the clipped professional tones that masked the emotional intensity of the moment. Ghost found herself holding her breath as the US-60 settled into the compound, its rotor wash raising clouds of dust that would provide concealment from enemy observation, while simultaneously making precise defensive fire nearly impossible. 30 seconds. That was the target time for loading wounded personnel and extracting from a hot landing zone under enemy fire. 30 seconds during which every Taliban fighter in the area would be trying to destroy the helicopter with everything from rifle fire to rocket-propelled grenades. Ghost's remaining ammunition wouldn't last 30 seconds if she tried to suppress every potential threat, which meant she had to choose her targets with the surgical precision of someone who understood that every bullet counted. A muzzle flash from a ridge line 800 meters north of the compound caught her attention, the brief flicker of light that indicated someone was taking aimed shots at the rescue helicopter. Ghost rolled into a diving attack, her cannon spitting the last of her 20 rounds at a target she could barely see through the dust and smoke that obscured the battlefield. Dustoff 7-1, you're taking fire from the North Ridge. Displace immediately upon loading. Copy Ghost, we're almost loaded, 30 more seconds. 30 seconds felt like 30 minutes as Ghost watched her fuel gauges approach critical levels, while the US-60 completed its loading sequence under intermittent enemy fire. The helicopter lifted off in a cloud of dust and rotor wash, banking hard to clear the mountain ridge that surrounded the compound on 3 sides. Behind it, the second US-60 was already beginning its approach, ready to extract the remaining SEALs who had held their position for nearly 40 minutes against overwhelming odds. Ghost's low fuel warning was now accompanied by audio tones that indicated she had perhaps 2 minutes before her departure became mandatory rather than recommended. She climbed to altitude and began calculating a flight path back to her forward operating base, hoping that headwinds wouldn't force her to declare an emergency and request priority handling for an aircraft that was running out of options. Ghost Trident 6 Alpha, all personnel extracted successfully. "Thanks for keeping us alive up there. We owe you one." The simple statement carried emotional weight that no official commendation could match. 8 Americans were going home because one pilot had chosen to remain in a deteriorating tactical situation long enough to provide the cover that made their rescue possible. Ghost keyed her radio for what would be her final transmission from the target area. "Trident 6 Alpha, Ghost. It was an honor to serve with you gentlemen. Stay safe down there." As she banked toward home, Ghost could see smoke rising from multiple points around the compound, marking the locations where her ordnance had found its targets throughout the engagement. The Taliban would reoccupy the area within hours, erasing the physical evidence of the battle while adding another entry to their own casualty lists. But 8 American warriors would live to fight another day, and in the mathematics of warfare, that represented a clear victory regardless of strategic implications or tactical complexities. Her fuel gauges showed levels that would require careful flight planning and perhaps a prayer or two, but Ghost had been managing fuel emergencies since her first combat deployment. The F-16 was a forgiving aircraft in the hands of an experienced pilot, and she had learned to coax maximum range from every gallon of JP-8 through techniques that weren't taught in flight school, but were passed down through the informal network of combat aviators, who understood that fuel management was often the difference between mission success and ejection over enemy territory. The radio crackled with updates from the extraction force as the helicopters cleared the immediate area and began their flight back to base. All personnel were accounted for, casualties were stable, and the mission was being classified as a successful rescue operation, despite the complexity of the tactical situation and the sophistication of the enemy response. Ghost allowed herself a moment of satisfaction as she monitored her engine parameters and navigation systems, the routine tasks that filled the long minutes between adrenaline-fueled combat and the safe landing that marked the end of another mission. But even as she flew through the dawn sky above Afghanistan's mountains, Ghost understood that today's success was temporary in a conflict that measured progress in years rather than individual battles. The Taliban would analyze their failure, adjust their tactics, and prepare for the next engagement with the methodical patience of fighters who viewed warfare as a generational struggle rather than a series of discrete military operations. American forces would rotate home, deploy again, and continue the complex dance of counterinsurgency operations that had defined this conflict since its beginning. Her forward operating base appeared on the horizon as a collection of concrete structures and metal buildings that represented safety and resupply in a landscape where both were precious commodities. Ghost began her approach checklist while monitoring radio transmissions from air traffic controllers who were tracking multiple aircraft returning from missions throughout the theater. It was routine traffic punctuated by the occasional emergency declaration or priority request that indicated someone else was having a difficult day in Afghanistan's unfriendly skies. The F-16 touched down with the gentle bump that marked a successful landing after a combat mission, the aircraft settling onto the runway like a predator returning to its den. Ghost taxied to the parking area where ground crews were already preparing to service her jet for its next mission, the cycle of maintenance and operations that kept combat aircraft ready for whatever crisis might develop in the coming hours. As she shut down her engines and began the post-flight inspection, Ghost reflected on the morning's events with the analytical mindset that combat pilots use to process experiences that civilian aviators would find difficult to comprehend. She had expended all of her ordnance, operated at the limits of her fuel capacity, and maneuvered through defended airspace while providing close air support to ground.